Now here is our requirements traceability matrix, as you can see. Now here is our database schema relationships. As you can see, the users tab has the fields user ID, username, account ID, recipe ID, and approved ID. The user ID primary key is then connected to the feedback tab, which allows the user to provide the feedback to the developer. The account ID is then connected to the create account tab, which will then allow the user to create its account in order to access the recipe application. The recipe ID is then connected to the manage recipe tab, which will allow the user to add, edit, and delete a recipe after he has created his own account. The approved ID is then connected to the validate user tab, which is then connected to the developer, since the developer will need to validate first the account that the user had created before the user will be allowed to have access to the manage recipe tab. The manage recipe tab is connected to the reference in order for the ingredients to be recorded to the recipe that will be added by the users. Now here is our form, and as you can see, here is the recipe ID, the developer ID, the added recipe, which is Angus beef roasted, and the reference ID. Then here are the users that added the Angus beef roasted recipe, which is Alan. Account ID of 1, recipe of 1, and approved ID of 1. Since there are 2, I can show that. There are 3 recipes, and let's move to the next recipe, which is boiled egg in nido soup. Then the user that added the recipe is Ben. Account ID of 2, recipe ID of 2, and the last recipe is chicken teriyaki, which Chris added. Account ID of 3 and recipe ID of 3. That is the manage recipe form. And now we go to developer query form. Now here is the developer ID, which is 1, approved ID of 1, and of the approved user, which is Alan. Now here's the user query, the username, which was approved by the developer, which is Alan, the user ID of 4, account ID of 1, recipe ID of 1, approved ID of 1, feedback ID of 1, and his feedback showing, which is response is a very good app, thanks, and his rating of 10. There are 3 records, so we move to the second one. The second user is Ben, username is Ben, and his feedback is best offers for recipes, great, and his rating. The last, the approved user, which is Chris, account ID of 3, and the feedback cool app that gives me all that I need, the rating of 10.